Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and self-publishing. Although we're branching a little out of the self-publishing into the publishing today with our very special guest, who we're delighted to welcome to the show, Adam Wilson, a comic writer and co-publisher of Read Furiously. So Adam, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, well, we are very grateful you took the time to speak to us. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland, and welcome, Adam. Yeah, I mean, you run Read Furiously, which is a publisher, and you publish a variety of different stuff. But what we're mainly want to talk about today is the idea of writing and publishing comics and graphic novels. So more of the the visual medium in terms of where you go with publishing generally, right? So why don't you start us off by telling us how you got started with Read Furiously and with your own sort of graphics, comics and graphic novels, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I kind of got started in comics just almost as a way to avoid real life. Like I was a senior in college, and I was kind of this burnt out pre-law major, and I knew I was no longer staring down the barrel of law school. I just didn't know what I wanted to do after I graduated. And I was having like one of those late night conversations with a friend that was like, what are we going to do? We're one semester away from graduating. We have no idea. And, he was a design major. And so he was always doing different artistic projects. And so it was kind of like the conversation evolved, over the course of the evening from, what are we going to do? What are we going to do to, could we do something together? Could there be some way we could collaborate together to do something interesting that we might actually enjoy once we graduated from college? And so we came up with the idea to do a comic. And I'd always been writing as far back as I can remember, and comics was always one of those things that was a little off limits to me, just because I'm a horrible artist. So I never really thought of it as something that I could do. But knowing that I had this friend who was such a great artist, I thought maybe it's worth a shot. And so we played around. We ended up writing and drawing a couple different little mini comics. We snuck into the computer lab at the school after hours and printed out more copies than we probably should have. We stapled them on our floor. And then we just went around. We sold them to friends. We sold them in different local comic shops. And yeah, we kind of spent our last semester of college doing that. And then ultimately, we ended up graduating. We kind of just got absorbed into the real world, and he, was able to move on to doing a lot of really awesome things from a design perspective. I still kind of wanted to do the comic thing. I really, really loved it. And so I just said, you know what, let me see if there's anyone out there that's in a similar situation as me. And surprisingly, there were a bunch of people. So I started collaborating with different artists on different projects. I started getting short stories published in anthologies, things like that. And then little by little, I just started taking on these larger projects. I eventually got to the point where I really wanted to try my hand at writing a full-length graphic novel. I had this story idea that wouldn't fit in, a single issue, wouldn't fit into a short story. And so I just ran with it, and I just started writing and writing and writing. I ended up teaming up with an artist down in Argentina who was incredibly talented. We worked on the book together for about a year, started pitching it wherever we could. And eventually there was a publisher based out of Philadelphia called 215 Inc. who picked it up. And so, that was kind of like my first foray into like the graphic novel side of things, as opposed to just, comics and simpler things like that. And so, I had that released, and then, comics writing eventually kind of took this evolution into, oh, well, you write comics, could you edit comics too? And, I had never done it before, but me just loving the idea of trying it, I said, sure, of course I can, hoping that I could figure it out along the way. And so I really dove into like the technical side of understanding comics. I devoured all of Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics series, and just really tried to understand the craft from both a technical and a storytelling perspective. And, I started working for 215 Inc. for a few years. And then eventually I wanted to move on, because working with them, I wasn't really able to focus much on my own creative projects as I wanted to. So at the same time, my partner, Samantha, was going through a similar situation. She was a writing professor, and she was working at, sites like Bustle and the Mary Sue, writing for them. And we both kind of had this moment where we said, we want to be doing more for our own projects. Maybe there's a way we could do that. And so we kind of sat down and we said, well, maybe we could start something of our own that gave us a little bit more control over the types of projects we published, how we published them. So that way we could find a little bit better work-life balance in terms of working on other people's stuff, working on our stuff. And Read Furiously kind of came from that. And so we started talking with a few of our friends who were creators that were really struggling to kind of get their foot in the door. They were poets who were writing, but their poetry it was too trauma-based and none of the publishers wanted them. Or, we had, people who were writing for the LGBT community, and none of the mainstream publishers really wanted to touch them. So we just started tapping these people and saying, you know what, let's do something together. Let's figure out a way that we can kind of make your work shine the way you want it to. And Read Furiously kind of grew from that. And so we've been doing that for about 10 years now, I would say. And we've just kind of grown over the years to the point where we're doing comics and graphic novels. We're doing anthologies, we're doing fiction, nonfiction. We have one of my favorite little series that we do is called, I say little because it's actually a little small book, not little, but in the scope of it, but it's called the One and Done series, where we take all these different types of books and we shrink and we make them pocket size, so that way you kind of always can have a book with you on hand. It literally will fit in your pocket, the same size as a cell phone. And that way, wherever you go, you can be reading if you want to be. And we've done graphic novels in that format. We've done poetry. We've done fiction. And it's just a lot of fun to do.
That's genius. That is absolute genius.
Thank you.
I'm fans of all these thrillers and James Bond books. And the thing about James Bond books, they used to be, you'd slip in your pocket.
Exactly.
And then we've missed that. Now they're all big, freaking chunky 6x9 books So there we go. I'm sorry, I digress, but genius.
Oh, no, it's okay. Yes, thank you. And that was kind of the whole point of it, too, is like, when we first started Read Furiously, one of the things that we would do is we would do local events in our area to try to kind of like introduce people to the company. And so we would do book festivals, we would do punk rock flea markets, we would do poetry festivals. And the biggest comment that we always got from people was, oh, I would love to read, I just never have enough time. And so we were like, let's figure out a way to solve that problem. And we're like, well, if you had a book that you could carry with you, that would be easy. If you had a book that didn't have 6 volumes of continuity that you had to remember, that would be easy. So we kind of came up with this like idea of, let's create these like little pocket-sized books that are all their own self-contained stories, work with some of our favorite writers that we want to feature. And, it's a series that everyone who works on it has a great time doing, and we always have a great time publishing them, and people really responded to them so far.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, really.
Thank you.
Very innovative, which is what you need these days to
Exactly.
stand out as a publisher with so much competition out there. So tell me about the process of writing a comic. That's something that I think a lot of authors probably don't even think of, because it's just so vastly different in our minds than writing a book. But it's still, at the end of the day, it's still storytelling, right? So
absolutely,
it's something that authors could do, and as you said, you weren't an artist, so that's another area where people probably think it just ends the conversation, right? They're like, well, I'm not an artist. Like, I can tell stories, but to be a comic book writer or a graphic artist, I have to know how to draw. But that's obviously not the case.
It's really not. And I mean, comics is one of those things where it is storytelling. It's storytelling with a few extra pieces added into it. So I mean, thinking about how I used to approach storytelling before I ever started doing comics and how I started writing comics, it actually was never that different for me. It always started in the same place. Like, it always started with, what's the idea? What's this thing kind of floating around in my head that I've been trying to figure out that I want to kind of put on paper. And then, building out the world, building out the characters from there. And, all of that is always the same. It's always like starting at those same places. And then it kind of diverges a little bit, because then you have to kind of think in two different streams. You have to think from a narrative perspective and a visual perspective. So the narrative perspective is, kind of the traditional storytelling of, the plot, the character development, what themes are you exploring, all of that, and kind of making sure that that maps out clearly. And then you almost have to take that and think of it like a cinematographer in a movie. You know, like what are the visual moments that are going to help you capture all of that on a page? And you kind of have to play it for the big and the small. So there's this great thing that I'll probably reference him a lot in this, but Scott McCloud, that he talks about in terms of closure, and that has to do with action that happens between the panels of a page, because that's technically where your storytelling takes place, is in all of those gaps. So you have, you know, the visual of what's happening in a single instance, and then you have the visual of what's happening in a second instance. And you have to make sure as a storyteller, you're kind of following those sequences in a way where it's going to make logical sense, so that as a person's looking at it, they're saying, okay, so I see a person standing in front of a door, person's standing in front of an open door in a room. They obviously walked through the door in that middle space where, you know, where we didn't see what was happening. And to do this, you have to kind of play with speed, you have to play with pacing, because, you know, sometimes that panel can represent a week's worth of time. And if you make a very clear transition between one and the other, it's very clear what's happened in that week's time. Whereas sometimes if it's, you know, it's a fast-paced action scene, you may have, you know, split seconds happening in between each panel. And so it's really figuring out, like, what is that pacing that you need to follow that's really going to make sure that the story flows in a way that's natural for someone to understand it. And so that, I think, is one of the biggest difference between, you know, traditional prose and fiction writing and comic writing, because you do have to think in that liminal perspective where you're kind of mapping out things chronologically along with just narratively.
I like that.
Yeah,
it's fun.
Yeah, you end up just sort of cutting out, I guess, some of the stuff that in a story would be that filler, like, well, you know, she walked through the door, you know, like it's, but you have to figure out ways to do that where you're not actually losing anything. Exactly.
Yeah.
I love it. It's funny how, you know, a few years ago, teachers used to be like, oh, graphic novels aren't real books. And I've always disagreed with that. I mean, I learned to reading Tintin books, the old Paul and Destiny and stuff like that. It's like, there's such a brilliant introduction. You can do so many other things. So it's great to hear you know, explain like the challenges of storytelling through graphic novels, because they're challenges, but the legitimacy of the storytelling that you can do in a graphic novel is no different to the storytelling from a book.
No, absolutely. It's true. And I mean, right out of college, one of my first jobs was working as like an instructional aide in the classroom. So I wasn't really like the teacher, but I was working with the kids who needed extra help. And graphic novels were a huge thing for them because, you know, they were struggling with ADHD, dyslexia, things like that. So it was very hard for them to stare at a page of words. But, you know, I gave them a book like Bone or, you know, Hilo, something like that. And they devoured it. Like I had a kid who I couldn't get to read a single chapter of Hatchet, but went through 3 volumes of the Bone series in a single night because he was just so enthralled by it. And it was just so much easier for him to consume. And it ended up being this like gateway for him, because I was like, okay, you really like Bone? Here are 6 different fantasy series that you could like that are very similar to it. And, you know, it was a mix of comics, it was a mix of, you know, fiction. But because he had that introduction and because he knew that like there are stories out there that I like hearing, he was willing to put in the extra effort to kind of like work his way through the prose books. And, you know, he became a really avid reader as a result of it.
I love that. That's brilliant. You probably changed the entire trajectory of his life with that.
I don't know. I lost touch with him over the years, but he definitely, for that year that I was with him, he was a much different kid after that.
I keep thinking of like the difference that reading has made to my life, and you think it can change the trajectory of someone's life, and you managed to find a way to introduce that to somebody who would otherwise have just been passed over by, you know, one-size-fits-all policies towards reading.
Exactly, yeah. And it was something that I really had to fight for too. Like even his parents weren't that excited about it. I remember like they had the Scholastic Book Fair that coming up a few weeks later, and he really wanted to keep buying the graphic novels. And like his mom actually, I had to set up like a conference call with her and like explain, it's like, yes, I know he's going to spend $30 on these books that he can read in an evening, but like, trust me, it will be worth it because he'll want to keep reading all of this stuff, and, you know, he'll want to keep going with it. And so it really did, like, it can be a struggle and a fight sometimes to like you said, like to earn that legitimacy, but it's there if people are willing to look for it.
Yeah, I wondered too, like how much there are books that get converted into graphics novels. Like I know that my son was reading a series called Wings of Fire, and he would read the books, but then he would also want to get the graphics novels. And I was like surprised that because you're kind of like rereading it, but
Yeah.
it's a different medium. And I wonder, and I never personally read any of those books, so I don't know what the difference is, and I probably should ask him. But when you take the novel, it's this full length novel with just words, and then you have a graphic novel, which is obviously much smaller. You must be losing something, but I guess there's a way to convert that to still tell the essence of the story.
There absolutely is, yeah. And I think a good comparison that I actually always like to make in that instance is audiobooks. And because this is something that my partner always says a lot, is that with audiobooks, it limits you a little bit because you're getting one specific person's interpretation of the narrative. And the way that they read it emotionally may not be the way that you read it emotionally. And that can kind of change the context within the story. But at the same time, it could also offer you a whole new perspective on the story that you might not have gotten if you had only read it yourself. So I think graphic novels kind of works the same way. It's like you look at the things that, from a storytelling perspective, that the artist and the writer chose to emphasize within the panels. You look at the way they, focus on certain characters from certain angles and certain scenes. It can definitely change the emotional impact that something might have. But at the same time, it's a little bit limiting, but it can also at the same time be very enlightening because, it's assuming that when you read it and they read it, they're both kind of interpreting the same way.
And it's one of the joys, I think, of reading things in different mediums. It's like you can read a book and then you can listen to the audiobook, and they're two different experiences.
Yep, exactly.
Or the graphic novel as well. They've got a great thing of graphic novels of books now, which is a great way to introduce some people to them.
Exactly. And that's one of the things.
Right.
My son is actually a huge fan of that series as well. He's only 6, so he's not at the age where he can actually be reading the books, but he loves the graphic novels, and like they're just at his reading level. So it's one of those things where it's like we've introduced those to him, and now we know that probably as soon as he's hit that reading level where he'll be able to understand it, he's going to go and he's going to read every single one of those, even though, like you said, he's already kind of read it in one format.
Yeah, it's like watching a movie or reading the book. There's always so much more. We always talk about how there's always so much more in the book. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And especially when there's a series or a book that we love that we've read first, and then we see the movie, you always sit back and talk with your friends about how, the book was so much better. But it's like, but that doesn't, and sometimes it's hard to, like when I watch movies or shows that were made into books that I've read, in my head, even though I love it, like so Game of Thrones or whatever, right? In my head, I'm always thinking about what they didn't do and what they missed and all that stuff. And then I'm thinking, oh yeah, it wasn't great because they didn't do this and they didn't do that. But for somebody who hasn't read the book, that's irrelevant, right? And so I often wonder, would somebody be able to follow along, or the Dune series, right? Would somebody be able to follow along if they hadn't read the books? Because I read the books and I understand all these things, but usually they do when you talk to them, and it sounds like they got it. But the things that were dropped were not necessary to the story that they chose to focus on, the part of the story that they chose to focus on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Dune is a great example because, like, I read Dune when I was a teenager, and my son and I just watched the movies, and the movies are a great adaptation of it. And the books these days are quite intimidating to get into when you're younger. Like I grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere and had no friends and just a huge library, so I had no choice. But these days you've got so many other things to attract your attention, so it's great to see them put in a different format.
Right. Have you ever sort of rewritten your comics or graphics novels and turned them into actual, novel, like non-graphic novels?
Not yet. No, I have tried doing the reverse. I'm in the process of actually doing that right now. I had a short story that was published years ago in an anthology as a prose piece, and I was like, you know what? This was good, but this was just a short little story. I bet if I wanted to flesh this out, I could kind of take this as a framework and really build like a something really interesting visually with it. So that's something I've been playing with. And one of the things I'm even working on that I have coming out recently is kind of one where I was towing the line between how I wanted to actually do it for probably the first year and a half that I was writing it. So I had this story that I really wanted to tell, and I didn't know how to do it. So I was just kind of like making all of these notes upon notes, and I was writing bits and pieces, but I could not find a format that I liked at all. And so, at first I was like, oh, you know what? I'm gonna do it. It's gonna be a fiction book, definitely. And then, 6 months down the line, I was like, no, this needs to be epistolary. I'm gonna do an epistolary book. So it's all gonna be journal entries. It's all gonna be, transcripts from things. I'm gonna write it like that. And then, 6 months further down the line, I was like, no, there needs to be a visual component. This book won't work without a visual component. And so it eventually came to the point where I actually ended up combining epistolary storytelling and graphic storytelling. And that was the route I ended up going with. And it's something that I did a lot of research to see how it could be done, because I wasn't really sure if there were any good examples out there. I didn't find any like full-length graphic novels that have done it. Like I'd find single comic issues of things where it was all like the narration was a letter that kind of ran through the entire course of the story of the issue, but I never found a full-length graphic novel that had done it. And so I was like, this needs to be done. I need to try this out. And so I kind of wrote these two separate pieces to the same story, where one of it was this entire visual narrative that took place over the course of the panels and the pages, and then I matched that with all of these, like I said, transcripts, letters, emails, interviews, things like that. And I tried to find a way to marry the two, and so that it almost became like, when I pitched it to the publisher, I basically said, think of it like a really long block of music videos where each visual is a single story and each narrative is kind of a supporting piece to that. And sometimes they'll be completely in line with each other, or one is just kind of describing what's happening in the pictures, and the other will be completely dissonant, where you're kind of getting this one side of a story while seeing a completely other side of the story. And the way the two things play with each other is going to have just as important an impact in how the story plays out as what's being said and what's being seen within the pages.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and I think the idea of doing graphics novels and comics, it gives you the ability to try things and tell stories in different ways, like you're describing. Whereas with a novel, it's really just the words on the page. There's nothing more you can do with it, really.
No, it's true. And I think that's one of the things that like drew me to it in the beginning, because like I remember when we were doing those like little mini comics in my dorm room, I didn't know how to do it, so I was literally in Microsoft Paint drawing squares and then like saying, okay, well in here let's have I'll draw a stick figure of this and that, and then let the artist fill in all the other details. And I basically delivered it to him like that. I'm like, here's the story, do with it as you please. And like the things that he would, like the way that it would evolve for him, like with what he added in terms of the depth and the perspective and the detailing that he put into each panel, is like, that's so much more than I ever thought could even be on that page, which is awesome.
Now, to digress a bit, one of the things you keep saying is you're a writer rather than an artist. Like,
yeah.
If people are listening to this and they have in their head, oh, I've got a story, it would make a great graphic novel, but how would you even begin that as a writer? Where does that journey even begin? I mean, for you, where did it begin?
So for me, like I said earlier, it always begins kind of with the idea, making sure you kind of understand what you want the story to be, making sure you understand like the themes and, the character development, the plot, because all of those are actually going to impact what has to go into the art. So for example, if you want to write, a hard-hitting noir detective story, that's going to have a much, much different art style than if you were going to write a young adult romance novel. So you really like understanding all of those kind of like underlying elements of your story will really kind of help you in making those decisions later on in terms of what the visuals of the book are going to be. So, start by understanding, what's the tone of your book? What do you want it to be very dark and brooding, where it's only, heavy blacks on white, or do you want it to be very pastel based, where it's a lot of light colors? Each of those, elicits a different emotional response as people look at it, and it'll impact how someone reads a story the story on the page. So, you kind of start by thinking it from that perspective as you're kind of trying to map out what the story is going to be. And then once you kind of have those pieces, there are two different ways that it can be done. There's what's called the Marvel way, which is an old-fashioned way they used to do it, where the writer would literally just write a short story, hand it over to the artist, and then it would be kind of completely up to the artist to determine, okay, what are the beats, what are the moments that I need to illustrate to make this short story make sense visually? And then what they would do is they would kind of take that, hand it back to the writer, and then the writer would take it and he would say, okay, so I need to add some kind of narration here that explains what's going on. We need to have some kind of dialogue in here between these two characters so we understand like what's moving the story forward here. And so that was kind of the way that it used to be done by some folks for a while. Nowadays, it's much more common for a comic writer to write a script, and almost like a screenplay, where they will kind of break down panel by panel, page by page, what's happening. So you'll actually get something where it's like page 1, panel 1, a long spanning shot of this scene. Panel 2, closing on our main character. He is doing this. Panel 3, transition to this kind of angle so that we can see this is also happening in the background while the character's doing this. And you really have to, and that's why I kind of said before, like you have to think about it like a cinematographer, because you really have to take into account like all of those details of how this is going to play out and how it's going to work visually as you're telling the story. So you can kind of figure out what those beats are, what those moments are.
Yeah, I wonder if it sounds to me like it's almost like two different things, where in sort of the Marvel way or whatever, it's like more collaborative, where you have the writer and the illustrator who are coming together to write a book together, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in the new way, the more common way that for now, where you're describing each panel, it's almost like it's more about the writer, and then they sort of hire an illustrator to bring it to life. And because illustrators have different styles, you might want to always use that same illustrator, but it's still, the storytelling is much more on the shoulders of the writer of the script, of the story, of the panel by panel description, right? Is that right? Or
that's definitely true. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot more that's kind of on the writer's shoulder, but I mean, I've personally found that actually some of the best moments that I kind of have seen in some of my work is when I let the artist I'm working with go off book a bit, because again, like even within a comic strip, it's going to be interpreted differently. I may say, I want a close-up shot of this character doing this, and the artist will think, okay, well, maybe it would be better if we did it kind of like as a shot where it's just of this and they're kind of more in the background so you don't see it. And so sometimes when that happens, it changes the story completely, but it changes it in a way that's really, really awesome. And so it is a lot more on the writer, but I think the writer still needs to be open to what the artist can give to the story. Like, that they are comic artists for a reason. They understand the visual medium in a way that the writer never will. And so even though you're the person who may have the ideas of, hey, this is a good way to pace the story going through this page, they may be able to look at it and say, no, it would work better this way. And so if you do that, then it makes it so much, it can produce so much more interesting things.
Right. So typically, how is the process done in terms of who gets sort of what? Like, if you're working on it completely collaboratively, you're a team where one person's the artist and one person's the writer, especially if you're doing it in either the more of the Marvel way or more of the going off book kind of way. You almost feel like there should be some kind of like 50-50 split, right? Whereas if you're writing, when it's completely your idea, you've come up with it, you write it panel by panel, and you just want to hire an illustrator to do it, then you kind of want to be like, okay, well, I'm going to get all the money for it, and then I'm going to pay the illustrator like a flat fee for doing it or whatever. But I don't know, like maybe that's not how it works at all. So why don't you tell us sort of how that sort of usually works, or what the options are?
Yeah. So I mean, for the most part, you are going to find situations where it's better to pay the artist up front. I mean, ethically speaking, just because it's such a larger endeavor to be able to take a book or take a script, interpret it, illustrate it. It's much more time consuming. It's much harder on a person's body. Like, you know, I hear stories of some of my friends who've been working as illustrators for years, and it's like, you know, they'll be like, oh yeah, hey, listen to this, and you can just hear it's like a cement grinder their wrists. Or like, there was a story of an artist who he couldn't hold his pencil anymore to illustrate, but he was on a deadline, so he like poked it through a tennis ball, and he would just his arthritis was so bad that all he could do was hold the tennis ball, but he was able to do that and draw and get his deadlines done.
Wow.
So yeah, so I mean, you know, just from that perspective, I think if it's your idea and it's not something that's wholly collaborative, where the two of you like from the very beginning sat down and said, hey, let's do this thing together, let's work on it together and have everything be a complete and total collaboration, I think it behooves you to find a way to pay upfront for the artist that you're working with. And also, then from that perspective, it does make it a little bit more, you know, if this is your idea as the writer, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of say, okay, well, you know, this isn't, you know, I appreciate your feedback, but, you know, this is my idea and I want to make sure it kind of comes fully to the vision that I had of it. But again, I mean, I try not to do that because I think some of the best, like I said, some of the best stuff that I've seen has come from those random moments when they decide to go off book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking more in terms of like, because it sounds like you're saying paying upfront to the illustrator is more ethical in the sense that they're getting some fee that they are okay with getting and they're paid for their work and all that stuff, right? Whereas I was thinking more in terms of like, if you had some big hit and everybody loved your graphic novel and you paid that person upfront a flat fee, and now you become rich off of the fact that they did amazing drawings on your story, then it might become less of an ethical thing, you know, or well, more of an ethical issue, but less of an ethical choice to have paid them upfront. Although I guess when it comes to writing book 2, they might want to renegotiate at that point.
No, and I mean, that's kind of one of those things that you kind of have to go into it. I mean, knowing the terms of your deal. I mean, that I think I don't want to call out specifics, so I won't say names of the series, but because I think I know which one it was, but there was definitely a series that got it was a relatively well-known series within the comic world, but it got picked up by a network and just blew up. Like, it was suddenly incredibly popular. It was suddenly super it was everywhere, and as a result, the books picked up as well. And you know, as a result, the author suddenly had an influx of royalties that they were getting, and the artist said, well, hey, you know, you paid me flat fees up front, and this kind of took off, and it ended up turning into a bit of a legal battle between the two of them in terms of establishing, like, yes, I was an artist for hire, but, you know, this book wouldn't exist without me, and, you know, all the actors who were in this series are based off of designs that I made, so that wasn't really your input as much as it was mine. So where do those lines within the intellectual properties lie? And yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that you kind of have to think through in advance and make sure that you and the artist feel comfortable with it. You know, that kind of just goes back to the whole, like, know what you're getting into when you sign an agreement with someone, when you kind of agree to collaborate with someone, know what the terms of that collaboration is. Kind of, even if it's a friend, don't leave ambiguity there for there to be like those situations exactly like you described, where, you know, you may have paid them $5,000 to draw a book, but then you made $150,000 off of the royalties. Like, you know, make sure you kind of understand what those lines are in advance, and always be generous, I think, too, is a good, like, personal thing. Like, I always, within the artists that I work with, if I'm paying them, I always will say, you know, once I've recouped whatever money I've made from this book, or, you know, so if I paid you X amount of money, I get that back in royalties. Suddenly it becomes a profit sharing thing, you know? I think that's completely fair, that, you know, it's kind of like your investment has been paid and now it deserves a chance. You don't necessarily have to keep all the royalties to yourself. It's a little bit more equitable to kind of split it with the person, even if it's not a 50-50 split, because maybe that wasn't the original agreement. But, you know, to completely cut them out just because those were the terms that you set up in the beginning, I think that will burn more bridges than it will make.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean,
Yeah.
that's the same when you work with editors and proofreaders and other collaborators. But I guess like there's so much of graphic novels that you can't do on your own unless you're like a Renaissance person.
Yeah, exactly. Because the art.
Yeah, and there's a style to it too, right? Like you can often change your editor, or your person that does your layouts, or you can interchange those without really affecting your story much. But if you're doing a graphic novel and you changed artists, I mean, it would probably be pretty obvious to anybody looking at it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that makes sense. I think that the idea of getting back your initial investment first and then changing it to some sort of profit share, even if it's only a percentage, a smaller percentage, because it wasn't sort of their idea or whatever, I think that makes sense too. But so what happened in that case? Did they win their lawsuit?
I think it was a few years ago. I think they eventually just settled out of court, because the two people were, they were friends, they were colleagues for a long time before that happened. So I think, it got dirty for a little bit, and then they both realized, hey, we're friends, we collaborated on this for a long time, let's not ruin the relationship because of this. So they settled out of court, and as far as I can tell, they're still friends.
Yeah, I mean, listen, when it comes to money, sometimes funny things happen, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it is a good idea to sort of know what you're getting into. And I guess when somebody's doing the artwork and they make that initial flat fee agreement, they're just thinking, okay, it's a piece of work. But then all of a sudden they start seeing their artwork on the side of a bus and in prime time, they might start to feel a little different. Yeah, I get it. That's funny. So in terms of like, you have your thing coming out, and you had mentioned earlier about pitching things to a publisher or whatever. Do you not publish your graphic novels through your Read Furiously, or was that before you started that?
No, I do, yes, and it is coming out through Read Furiously in October, but we are very equitable, so we don't favor ourselves in any way. If one of us wants to do a project, it does have to go through the editorial process. Like, we have to put together a pitch, and we have to say, okay, here's what I want to do, and the team has to review it and actually agree that it's a good idea and something worth publishing before they'll pick it up.
Oh, I see. So if you were doing something, it wouldn't necessarily be a slam dunk that Read Furiously would want to do it. You might.
No, yeah. I mean, we publish about 6 titles a year, so we're very discerning, and we have to, and as a result, we have to be very discerning with our own stuff as well. Like, there have been plenty of ideas that I've had, and even before I fully pitched it, I'd mentioned it to my partner, and I'd get this kind of like lukewarm, yeah, okay, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's not a good idea. That wouldn't be a good fit anymore. So, but yeah, I mean, we because we value the people that we work with so much, we don't, when it comes to having us be creators, we want to try and keep that relationship on an even keel and not play favorites just because we were the people that started the company.
Right, makes sense. I mean, if you're only publishing a few books per year anyway, then yeah, you don't want to play favorites for sure. So what kind of things if somebody was thinking about branching out into doing comics and graphics novels, where would they even start?
I mean, again, I'll go back to Scott McCloud. I think he wrote a really great trilogy of books called Understanding, Reinventing, and Making Comics. I would say, first of all, start there, just so you can understand kind of like the technical side of what comics is. I mean, he goes so far as to even break down the concept of understanding visuals in terms of how a light socket can look like a face and why that emotional relationship exists there. So he really dives deep into understanding how we use visuals to communicate and how that applies to comics. So I mean, that will give you so much information about what can be done with comics, and that will really help you kind of understand how you need to use it in order to tell your story. And then really just start reading graphic novels. I think that is like the best way that you can do it. Like when I decided that I wanted to start doing comics back in college, it was because I had been on this huge kick of reading people like Harvey Pekar, the Hernandez brothers, Jen Van Meter, Ariel Schrag, Marjane Strapapi, all of these people that were coming out at the time who were producing all of these amazing books that were so different from the like the superhero and the science fiction books that I kind of read growing up. They were things that I never thought were possible to do with comics, but I was seeing them. Like it kind of introduced a whole new perspective of what could be done with the medium. And as a result, I was like, okay, this is something I want to do. And I think really that's probably one of the best things you can do if you want to start getting into graphic novels, is just start exploring what's out there. Like it's a medium, it's not a genre. So like you can't necessarily say that all graphic novels are the same, because an American Splendor story and a Superman story are so drastically different that like they're not telling the same stories, they're not using sequential art form in the same way, but within that space you can find things that are similar to the stories that you want to be telling, or you can find empty spaces that exist that you want to try and fill with your storytelling. You may look around and say, hey, no one is telling this type of story in comics, I'm going to try and do that. And that can be kind of where you take it off from there.
Yeah, I think that's really important, that it's a medium, not a genre. I'm definitely in the camp of the only graphic novels I know are superhero ones. I am aware that there are others, but I've never read any, I've never seen any. But I wonder, like, what's the feeling for the size of the market for graphic novels versus novels? I mean, it feels like maybe that, and really, I don't know, but it feels to me like that market is probably less saturated these days than novels. So maybe it's better, but I feel like it probably is also a smaller market. So, but you probably have a better idea of that.
Yeah, I mean, it is a smaller market. I mean, I remember the most humbling thing that I ever experienced in my comics career was I went to New York Comic Con as a professional for the first time. I got to sit on like a panel, or I got to watch a panel, I shouldn't say, because I wasn't on it, but I got to watch a panel with one of the editorial directors from Marvel, one of the editorial directors from DC, and then a few other, like the graphic novel buyer for Barnes and Noble, and a few other just like really, really high name people within the comics community. And I remember one of them saying, it's like, all of you who are here, who are professionals, you need to kind of reconcile the fact that all of us are indie presses by contemporary standards. Like Marvel and DC, who, sell probably more comic books than all other comic book publishers combined, by mainstream publishing standards, of looking at like the big five of like Penguin, Random House, Simon Schuster, all of them, they sell a fraction of what they sell. They are small press compared to, those other publishers. And so to be sitting there at that time when, my first book had just come out, I was, watching people who I assumed were the biggest in the industry saying, yeah, we're small scale compared to the rest of the industry. It was very humbling, but at the same time, it's like, because it's a smaller space, it's a much more inclusive space in some ways. So even though comics is a medium, not a genre, it's a medium that people are more willing to take a chance on. Like, because there are those underlying similarities between, graphic novels that are like a superhero graphic novel, a horror graphic novel, a slice of life, a YA graphic novel, because there's similarities in the way the stories are told, people are a little bit more willing to take chances on things that they've never would have heard of. So it almost makes it a little bit easier to crack into certain places, even though once you do crack into it, it is going to be a smaller group of people who are actually interested in it. Like, I have a hard time selling my book at traditional book fairs, but I go to a comic book store and do a signing. Like I'm going, this weekend is actually Free Comic Book Day, so I'm going to be doing a signing at my local comic shop. And, last time I did that, every single person who came up, was super interested, bought the books that I was selling, even though, like, looking at the things they had in their pile, I was like, okay, my book isn't like that. My book isn't like that. You would not like my book at all normally, but, they were willing to take the chance on it. And oftentimes they found that they really liked it because even though it wasn't something they typically read, they felt comfortable with the medium, and it let them kind of go outside their comfort level in a way that made it easier to accept a new type of story.
I love that. And that's so you went to New York Comic Con. Are you in Artist Alley? And
well, my publisher at the time had a booth there. Yeah, this was I'm gonna say 2013, 2014, so a few years back.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've been a few times. It's an experience. But yeah.
I know that's one of the things is like getting to meet people. We talk to writers who go to different conventions and go to fairs and things, and it's kind of cool to be able to like actually interact face to face.
Yeah. Oh, it's awesome. Yeah, and it's funny because I'd been as a fan a few times and just kind of like gone and geeked out over getting to see certain people whose work I always really loved, and then being on the opposite side of the table and sitting next to some of those people a few years later, it's a very surreal experience. Because it was like, I don't know if I deserve to be here, but we're both doing the same thing. We're both here because we have these books that we published, and so it's a very humbling moment.
I can imagine that. So
yeah.
Now we are approaching the top of the hour, so we are going to have to wrap up very soon. I was going to ask Craig, did you have any final questions for Adam before we start wrapping things up, and ask him where people can find out more about Read Furiously, etc., etc.?
Yeah, listen, I think that this is fascinating because it's really, like I said, it's something that as authors we're often thinking about different things we can do, but I don't know that it really crosses the minds of all authors to even consider writing comics and graphics novels because of those reasons I mentioned. Like they just don't think of themselves as an artist, or they don't really think of it as writing, when really it is. I mean, it is. You're still storytelling, and it's just like you said, it's a different medium, and that's all. So hopefully this maybe helps some people wrap their heads around that, and maybe someone out there has some ideas that really would fit into this kind of a medium. So thanks for coming on.
No, of course. I hope it helped.
Absolutely. So where can people find out more about Read Furiously, about your work? Tell us everything so people can find you.
Absolutely, yeah. So Read Furiously, readfuriously.com is our publisher website. We have, all of our current titles, all of our backlist titles, information about just the press in general and what we do. And also, submission guidelines for people who are interested. Right now we're only accepting, I think, for our one and done series, but we do have things coming up down the line for larger pieces, for anthologies that we're doing. So that's going to be updated regularly. You can follow them on Instagram at Read Furiously, facebook.com/readfuriously. Me, myself, I have my own personal website, lifeinasplashpage.com. So that's just kind of more specifically about my work. I also have been trying to collect over the years different resources that I found useful for comics creating. So I have a page where I posted, people who give lettering tutorials or art tutorials for how to do character design, body movement, things like that. There's actually a really great, for anyone who's looking to start writing comics but doesn't know how to, these two editors put together a standardized comic script format. So, because basically, I mean, writing a comic script is just kind of like, you do it in whatever way makes sense to you. And like everyone kind of had their own way of doing it. So these two editors got together and put together like a uniform format that they felt would work well for everybody. So I have a link to that up there as well for people to check out. And then obviously like links to, where to get my books, things like that.
That's awesome. Well, we will obviously pop a link down there in the description below so you can go and check out Adam's work. While you're down there, if you're watching this on YouTube or whether you're listening on a podcast, why don't you scroll down and leave Adam a comment? Let us know and let him know how much you've appreciated everything he shared with us today. And while you're down there as well, you should hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. And yeah, we will be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. But until then, Adam, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, no, thank you guys. This has been awesome.
And we'll be back next week. Cheerio.